Have a presentation, right? Okay, yeah. So, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for being present for this session. Really appreciate it. I personally believe, is working? Yeah. I personally believe that it's definitely going to be a very, very interesting day. We have tried to carve out the agenda in a fashion that really brings out what exactly is happening in the environment today. Whether it's with respect to futuristic frauds, which we personally believe, corporate India is going to get exposed. Whether it's with respect to technology, and you would have seen the agenda, it's on cybercrime. I think that's the buzz today in today's environment. As more and more business moves to technology, the risk of cybercrime goes up. I think that's another area of focus. Last but not the least, and that's my personal favorite, and if you refer to the agenda, it talks about perception of detection. I'll spend a couple of seconds or maybe a couple of minutes talking about it before I actually get into my presentation. The perception of detection theme actually came out from a concept called social control environment. Whenever I've presented or attended sessions, one of the questions which has always come up saying that how do you control fraud? If tomorrow you appoint Deloitte to come and do a fraud risk assessment or fraud risk management exercise, do you confirm that there won't be any fraud going forward in my organization? And the answer is no. I do not confirm that there won't be a fraud in your organization. I cannot, or I would say no one can give you a guarantee that if you put in certain controls, processes, systems, etc., in the way you run business, frauds will go down. They will not, and I'll tell you the reason why. They will not go down because fraudsters are futuristic, right? They are futuristic. They are more proactive in terms of how they think, what they do, right? While all the efforts to mitigate the risk of fraud is reactive. That's the fundamental disconnect we have in the way we run our business when it comes to exposure to risks like fraud. Now, what is social control environment? Social control environment is a fundamental shift in the way we've been brought up. I remember, I'm a Deloitte. In school, we were taught escalation is bad. You should never escalate, right? That's what we were taught, right? But when you look at some of the global developed economies, they teach escalation is good. Please escalate if you are not convinced about something. Please escalate if there are unusual things happening around you, because that's the right way to live life, right? The social control environment, which is the new buzzword today in corporate India, is all about escalation. It's all about the fact that escalation is good. So, I was very happy when the companies, new companies that came in. One of the things which it mandated was vigil mechanism, the whistleblower mechanism. Unfortunately, when you look at from an India context, it's still a new mechanism or new thing for us, because we don't know, genuinely we don't know how to use it effectively, right? We actually use it as a complaint box. Technically, it's not for a complaint box. It's actually used to create an environment where people have all the right, the empowerment to pick up a phone, write a mail, drop a mail in the post box, etc., to escalate an issue which they believe is not aligned to the principles and policies of the organization. And here I'm talking about corporate India, right? Very, very fundamental, right? It encourages employees to escalate things which they believe are not in the spirit of doing business, so that an action can be taken. That's social control environment. And I keep giving this example, and I've been giving this example for the last 18 years of my career, since the time I've been, dealing with fraud, is today, if someone in your office is taking stationery home, what do you think he or she will do? Will he or she go to the manager and complain? Maybe not. Because the worry is the manager himself may be taking stationery home, right? So what do? So you create an environment and mechanism where you say, please escalate, and action will be taken if it is not in the spirit of the principle and policies of the organization, right? And you demonstrate it, right? I don't know how many people, most of you would have heard the videos, and at the risk of being repetitive, I will still talk about the fact, zero tolerance What do you mean by zero tolerance? You know, every organization has a policy on zero tolerance, right? But there is a flexibility, right? There is a flexibility. If the fraud is for $1,000, ignore it. He's a top talent. How does it matter if he's taking stationery home, right? He's doing enough for the company. Let him take stationery home. What you've done is you've not demonstrated zero tolerance. You've actually demonstrated acceptability to a behavior which is just the tip of the iceberg, or maybe the starting point. And where it might land you, right, no one knows. So I think when you talk about zero tolerance needs to be demonstrated for the environment within the organization to believe that if I do something wrong and if I get caught, there will be a very serious action against it. The other thing is perception of detection. Now the perception of detection gets created by social control. If someone is doing something wrong, he or she should worry that, look, my colleague who sits right next to me will escalate it. There is a perception of detection, and I'll give you a very fundamental example here. Today, if your camera is here, and don't take it personally, but I'm just giving you an example. If there are cameras here, and we've actually put Mont Blanc pens on every table for every participant just to write, but not to take home. Not to take home. No one will take it home because there is a camera watching you. But if the camera is not there, there will be a lot of people who might just take the opportunity to take the pen home, right? So the perception of detection is the biggest deterrent of fraud. So when you go back into your organizations, I think the fundamental question which should come into your mind, how do you create an environment wherein people have this perception of getting caught if they do something wrong? Nothing wrong. Nothing wrong in creating that perception, because at the end of the day, it's good for the organization. I digressed a bit. Actually, this was not the thought which I had when I walked on the stage to present. I was thinking of presenting some global stats to you, but I will just step back and I will tell you one thing. Organizations, individuals like me too, always complain about the fact that we don't see much enforcement in India, right? When you see some of the developed economies in the globe, right? When there is a fraud incident which happens, right, you see very effective action, enforcement, punishment, etc., etc. There is severity of punishment, there is certainty of punishment, right? When it comes to India, the grouse or the concern, whatever you might say, is that, you know, there is no enforcement, right? There are a couple of reasons, and I thought I'll use this platform to share my thoughts on that. Couple of reasons why it is the way it is. First of all, we as individuals, we as corporates do not have an appetite to deal with law, right? I'm making a very strong statement. Please hear me carefully. We as corporates do not have the appetite to deal with law, right? The other thing which I want to highlight and explain to you, look, when you compare your ecosystem with an ecosystem which is significantly developed, it took that ecosystem which was significantly developed 2 to 3 decades to reach the stage of stringent enforcement. I think we are still evolving. As a country, we are still evolving. We have seen baby steps in the last couple of years. I personally believe there's going to be a transformational change, both in terms of how business is being run, also in terms of how legislation comes and starts monitoring how business is being run. And a classic example of that is the Companies Act. A great example of that is the Prevention of Corruption Amendment Bill once it gets passed. I think these are really defining changes which will actually bring a change in the way we run our business, right? You need to give India some time, or our country some time, right, to create that environment of stringent enforcement. Do we need 2 decades or 3 decades? I don't think so we need 2 decades or 3 decades. In fact, we don't have that much of time, because today India is in an inflection point, right? It is actually driving the economic revival globally. If India slows down, it is going to have a global impact. So I sense is in the next 5 to 7 years, you will see some transformational changes in our legal system. And again, I'm talking from a forensic or a fraud standpoint, right, which will have a significant impact in the way we run our business. There will be refinement in terms of the thought that this is the way business is run. you will go back and say, this is not the way the business is run. Right? And here I'm talking about bribery and corruption. That is going to change. Anyways, moving on to my slides. Fraud is something which we don't think on our daily lives. Even when we go to office, the last thing which comes to our mind is fraud, right? But the challenge here is that if we are not thinking about fraud in our business, someone else is. Someone else is. So I'm not saying that when you go back to office, start thinking about fraud, right? You need to have a mechanism or a structure wherein there are some processes, control systems which are actively monitoring what could go wrong in your business. And I know there are a lot of people from the internal audit function sitting here, right? I think the fundamental crux of an internal auditor is to understand what can go wrong. But the issue is it's more process and control focused. When you start looking at things, okay, fine, what could go wrong from a fraud standpoint, you will have a lot of open questions which possibly you don't have an answer and you need to find those answers. I think that's again a shift in terms of how we are running a business. I thought I'll just throw some stats purely from an India context. I don't want to spend too much of time on the slide. Having said that, we ran a survey last year, right? We released it in 2014, December, right? So it's as new from a context standpoint. 56% of the respondents came back and said that they believe that frauds are going to go up in the next 2 years. And I totally agree with that. We are in an aspirational environment. We are in an aspirational society. People have no time. Everyone wants to be number one. From a business standpoint, from a position standpoint, you will take shortcuts. Add to that, we have an evolving regime where enforcement is still, work in progress, let's put it this way. Right? So it's a great recipe for a fraud. Right? You will have instances where young talent will compromise, will take shortcuts, right? And do things which are not in line with the principles of the organization, right? And these instances will happen. So if someone gets up and says, we have never experienced a fraud in our company, I do not agree to that. I don't believe that because I believe frauds are happening in every organization, right? You would have created an environment where you're managing them, maybe detecting them, investigating them, taking action, but they are happening, right? The question is, are we catching everything which is happening? That's the question which you need to take back. Because it should not be like a ticking time bomb which explodes one day and we keep taking reference of one of the biggest accounting frauds which happened in the history of this world, which is Satyam. Right? I don't want to spend time on that, but I'm just saying that that went on for 10 years. It was a ticking time bomb, and when it exploded, it literally took the company down. Right? So you need to ensure that there is no ticking time bomb in your organization. Now, to think we know and understand all risks around us is definitely misleading. I mean, a lot of people have this self-confidence and belief, I know what is happening in my company, I trust my employees, I know they can't do anything wrong. To think we can manage all of them if they hit us is an illusion. The belief that if something goes wrong, I'll come to know about it is an illusion. Right? And to turn a blind eye to them is sheer foolishness. Why it's sheer foolishness? Because you've opened the can of worms. Right? You can't control it then. You cannot control it. You need to catch it when it happens to really make an impact in the organization. Some of the challenges, again, I think I mentioned about the fact that we are reactive. By nature, we are reactive. Right? We buy insurance after we get hit. That's the way we are. We look at prevention as a cost. We look at compliance as a cost and not as an investment. Globally, organizations have started looking at compliance as an investment because non-compliance is not an option. A non-compliance can bring a company down. So they have defined compliance as an investment to make sure that the company survives. Right? Again, a fundamental shift in the way they think. The usage of data analytics, I'll just get into some technicalities. Data analytics, everyone in this room knows. Look, interesting part is the world is saying there is so much of data in every organization. What are we doing about it? Are we just using it for reporting, or doing our statutory reportings at MIS? Or are we leveraging data to run our business in a much more professional, in a much more organized, right, in a much more diligent manner? Data analytics, I personally believe, is still work in progress because the problem is we cannot get rid of Excel. That's the problem. Even if you have an ERP in your company, you will still work on Excel. There will be a lot of data sitting on Excel. We cannot ignore Excel. We need to get Excel out of our systems if we need to start understanding how data can help us, right, run our business better. A fraud risk management program should be a shared responsibility. Another fundamental disconnect. I can bet my bottom dollar a lot of you believe that when it comes to fraud risk management, that is not our responsibility. That is the responsibility of the board, that is the responsibility of the CEO, that's the responsibility of the CEO, etc., etc. Right? It's actually a shared responsibility because when it comes and bites you, right, it does not identify who it bites the organization. Right? It takes the entire organization down. So it has to be a collusive kind of an effort to mitigate the risk of fraud. Couple of, again, data points, again, from a fraud survey we ran last year. 400 respondents, 59% said that, 3 things which you need to do to really implement good measures to mitigate risk of fraud: regular monitoring, assessment of fraud risks, conducting diligence, and last but not the least, being proactive when it comes to analytics. I think the fundamental point is you need to be diligent in the way you run your business. You need to be diligent in the way you run your business. Very, very important. Every step you need to ask a question, what can go wrong? Have I done my diligence before I've taken that decision? Very, very important. Monitoring, assessment, again, very, very important. There has to be a cover which is monitoring, okay, fine, anything and everything you do, right, you're doing it correctly. This survey also threw out excellent data points that majority of the incidents of fraud are caught by internal auditor. Right? I think globally it's at 3%, here it was 4%, but having said that, our expectation from internal audit should not be to catch a fraud. It should not be to catch a fraud. More often than not, when there is a collision, no control works. When there is a collision, no control works. The only control which will work in a situation of a collision will be social control, where someone will blow the whistle. So you need to create that social control environment which I was talking about right at the beginning of the session. Companies Act, I won't spend too much of time on it. One thing I would like to tell you, it is very interesting when it came out. I was very happy and proud about it because this is the first legislation in India, for the first time ever, fraud has been defined. Even the IPC does not define fraud. I'm sure some of you will raise your hands and say, oh, Contract Act defines fraud. No, but this was a true definition of fraud from a business context, right? First time ever fraud got defined. There's definition of theft, there's definition of cheating, etc., in the IPC, right? But there is no definition of fraud, and it's all encompassing. It's all encompassing, right? So now fraud needs to become a strategic issue, a strategic risk. It's no more an operational risk. Why is it a strategic risk? Because a fraud has the potential of bringing down a company. We have an example in India itself. 88% of the respondents felt that stringent enforcement can curb fraud. I totally agree with you. Stringent enforcement can definitely curb fraud. You need to demonstrate zero tolerance. The good part, in my experience, I have seen multiple organizations today going legal. They are very clear. We want to go legal. We want to punish the fraudster. No matter how much time it takes, no matter how much money it takes, we want to create an example that no one can take us for granted. Right? I think that's, again, a very exciting shift in the way business is happening. And I'm very happy that's happening the way it's happening, because this is the only way to manage this menace. Corporate compliance, a tough ask. I personally believe it's a tough ask. Look, corporate compliance is, again, this is a personal point of view. You can ask me questions later during the breaks, but I'll tell you, look, compliance is all about a personal touch. The way you deal and operate with your stakeholders, internal or external, has a very strong bearing on the larger population within the organization in terms of how business is run. If you compromise values being at the top of the table, right, the people below you will believe that's the way business is run, right? That's the culture of the organization. That's why they keep talking about walk the talk, tone of the top. I think very, very important. You need to demonstrate the fact that you are a compliant organization. You need to demonstrate and walk the talk when you talk about compliance. Personal values translate into actions which become a habit. It's habitual. That's the way businesses run. My time is up. This is my last slide. I'll take 30 seconds more. When we prioritize tasks, we ensure they get completed. Very, very important. Corporate compliance needs to become a priority. It needs to become an investment, and there is a return attached to the investment, and the return is you will not get caught. If you get caught, you are compliant, and if you're non-compliant, it's a huge cost, right? Last but not the least, actions reflect values, and therefore we monitor them to ensure they are aligned with our values. The way you operate with your external stakeholders has a very strong bearing on the larger organization. Belief systems exert a greater control on human behavior than laws imposed by the government, no matter what form the beliefs take. This is my last statement. If you look at your personal lives, right, your kids, the standard statement which every parent talks about, that's the value we give to our children when they are home. Whatever wrong things they learn in school, right? We attach everything to values. So we need to follow those values and beliefs if we want the larger organization to do what we think is right. I don't have any questions. I don't have any other slides. Have a great session. I'm sure you guys will enjoy it. We can meet over break if you have any questions. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you so very much, sir. And I'm sure all of us are looking forward to the day ahead. As I thank you, I'd like to invite on stage Ms. Thar to appreciate your presence and more. And like he said, he'll be available through the day, so you're more than welcome to get in touch with him. He's more than ready to take questions and more. It's been a pleasure having you here, sir.